Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the London Lyceum. I am your host, Jordan Stefaniak, and I'm here joined by Garrett Walden, who's with us. He's the senior editor at the London Lyceum. And then we also have two awesome brothers with us in Dr. Sam Renahan and Dr. Harrison Perkins. So this episode is designed, this discussion is really, the whole point of it is just to encourage dialogue and understanding regarding the topic of covenant theology. So one of the things we've always tried to do with the London Lyceum is encourage things like charity and curiosity, critical thinking, and cheerful confessionalism. And we found that hosting conversations like this in a format that is where people are able to talk to each other and then do it in a space that is safe to say things that you disagree with, but also praise those things you do agree with and come to understanding is really, really valuable. So I'm excited for this. This should be fun. I tried to get this to stream to Facebook too, but apparently I'm not good with Facebook. So sorry if you're trying to get on there, just come to YouTube. That's the place to be. So we plan to have a discussion for however long, and then we will be taking questions from the chat. So I've seen a couple of people asking questions already of, will we take questions? Yes, we will. But we do want to go ahead and start with just laying out the positions a little bit. So if you don't know, Dr. Renahan has a book on covenant theology, and you can go find that. It's published with Founders Press. And then Dr. Perkins also has a book on covenant theology. I think that's coming out soon from Lexham Press. So you'll have to go get that. If you're watching this in the future compared to when we're recording this now, I'll try to make sure to drop the link in here so you can go ahead and buy that there too and begin to understand and enjoy all the riches that are found in covenant theology. So let's go ahead and start. Harrison, I don't know. I'm gonna pick on you to go first. You're the only non-Baptist here, so I'll let you lead off and just give me that like 3 or 4 minute overview. Like, how do you understand covenant theology? What does it look like? Your framework, and then maybe once you've put that framework in place, how do you view? What are the main differences that you found in your view compared to something like a 1689 federalism?
Thanks, Jordan. I think the first thing I want to say is thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I think a lot of people in Presbyterianism talk about our Baptist friends, and they mean that just as a nice way to talk about Baptists. But I actually want to say, I mean, Garrett, I just met you. You seem like a lovely guy, though. But the other two, like, we're actually friends. Sam, like, I really enjoy his company. I find Jordan, like, tolerable.
Thank you.
I'm just kidding. I really like Jordan. So
I think that's a point where we disagree, actually. Whether Jordan is tolerable, but anyway, proceed.
Already getting into this disagreement. This is great.
So I mean, this is genuinely a chat among friends, and I'm really glad about that. And so Sam and I have done this on a couple. Sam was really helpful in helping me understand what he was trying to say when I was working on the draft of my book, and that is actually, that material got cut, but it's on a blog post on the Heidel blog. So anyway, all that to say is I'm glad to be doing this and glad to be doing it with you guys. My view. So I mean, I think I hold a fairly vanilla kind of Reformed covenant theology. The kind of bedrock principles of that is really about the law and the gospel, right? And the law demands perfect obedience if it's the means to be right with God, and the gospel promises that we can be right with God on the basis of someone else's obedience, namely Jesus Christ. And that distinction then undergirds, well, the difference between the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Before the fall, God made a covenant with Adam, and the premise was the demand for perfect obedience. And if Adam had fulfilled the law past the probationary test, well, then he would have inherited eschatological life because of his works. After the fall, after we sinned, that's not an open option for us because the law demands perfect obedience. And so salvation to the same everlasting life has to be on the basis of God's grace. And so then, in my view, there can be only two overarching categories: the covenant of works, the covenant of grace. The covenant of redemption among the person of the Trinities is kind of straddling both of those, right? Because it's a covenant of works for the Son. He renders perfect obedience in our stead, and it's covenant of grace for us because it's the foundation of our right standing with God. When we get to the covenant of grace, then I think where we start to have more need for discussion in this context is that I see the covenant of grace being delivered through the historical covenants, right? The offer of salvation in Jesus Christ offered through the ordinances, types and ordinances, whatever categories you want to look, the things that God told people to do in various covenants. Christ is always the foundation of forgiveness of sins, right standing with God, and blessings of everlasting life and sanctification here. And he is delivered to believers through promises, Genesis 3:15, through ordinances like circumcision, resembles baptism in my view as the initiation, but still depicting a benefit of Christ. Christ was cut off for us. And Mosaic sacrifices, right? Don't forgive anybody in themselves, but convey to us as means of grace Christ and his benefits to believers. And so to sum this up, really, it's Westminster Confession 8:6, which is almost identical in London Confession 8:6. Although the work of redemption wasn't wrought until Christ came in the incarnation, the virtue, benefits, and efficacy thereof, of his work, were communicated to the elect through the promises, types, and ordinances of every covenant successively since the beginning of the world. And that's really the foundation of my understanding of the covenant of grace, is that Christ and his benefits have been delivered to believers through the outward features of whatever covenant under which they lived. But it's always Christ and his benefits. And I think we can come back to that. But I think that's probably enough to get us going.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Sam, if you want to take your shot at just explaining your understanding of how the covenants fit together in a couple of minutes, then we can have a good discussion about the areas that we might find confusing or need some clarifying.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. So the difficulty here is that the particular Baptist or the Second London Baptist is going to say amen to everything that Harrison Perkins just said, and sincerely would say that. As he pointed out, our Confession 8:6 is almost identical to their Confession 8:6. Instead of the work wrought, talks about the price paid, but that's not a substantive difference. We agree that the virtue, the benefit, and the efficacy of Christ reached to all times, and even through the outward ordinances, as well as the types and the promises of the Old Testament. So if we're talking about the covenant of works, I agree with what Harrison said. If we're talking about the covenant of redemption, I agree with what Harrison said. If we talk about the covenant of grace as being the sole source of salvation in all history, founded on Christ's perfect and finished work, we're going to agree with what Harrison said. And so that's one of the reasons why, though our confession is quite different in chapter 7 from the Westminster Confession, it's in what it does say, it's really something that a Paedo-Baptist could affirm also. It's really what our confession doesn't say. That's where the disagreements come into play, and that's where we're taken more into the literature outside of the confession in the 17th century. So I don't feel the need to really rehearse the things that he said about the covenant of works, covenant of redemption, and the covenant of grace as the covenant of salvation in all of history, because I agree with them. And perhaps that would lead us more into, well, then where is the difference, or what are some of the differences, which would certainly be profitable and the purpose of this chat's not the right word, discussion.
Cool. That's helpful. So I know, and Garrett, I can't remember if I mentioned this. You're teaching through covenant theology at your church right now. So this is like a really opportune time to have Garrett with us to help ask some questions. So I don't know who wants to kick off the questioning, but I'll just say, oftentimes, at least on the internet, what I see is when this discussion flares up between differing parties, usually at some point there comes a level of, you don't understand what I'm saying, you're misunderstanding me. And that seems to go cut across both sides. So hopefully here we can get to the key aspects that we find that the other party may misunderstand quite frequently. So I don't know if either of you want to launch in and say, look, this is, raise my hand, this is one of those areas that I think people continue to misunderstand or misrepresent about what I hold. I don't actually hold that. So like, for instance, I can think of one that I think might be among Presbyterians regarding something like a 1689 federalism. And it would be like, Old Covenant believers weren't regenerated in the Old Testament or something like that. I think I've seen that in different places, and that may just be part of different people misunderstanding. Somebody down the line did a bad job at telephone. So I don't know where we want to start with this.
I think one of the things to start, just to set up this whole discussion in that vein, is there is a distinction in my mind of criticizing, what you said and what it implies. And so perhaps we've not always been super careful about, Sam can correct me on this. I don't think that I've put anything in public that he thinks misrepresented his view, but that's just me. That's not speaking for all the Presbyterians. But I've tried to describe, what he says, but then come back and say, I think it implies this, and I dislike that. So we can, I think that's a helpful thing to keep in mind here is, while I may understand what he is saying, and of course what he would come down and affirm, I think it sort of implies this outcome down the road, even though I know he doesn't want that. And that's not me trying to be uncharitable. But I am a grumpy Presbyterian. So, it happens. I'll take a shot at the first kind of, I wish people would quit saying that sort of thing. And we can either trade off or go down the list or whatever. So one of the ones that I hear a lot is, Mosaic sacrifices couldn't forgive sin in themselves, as if that's like a defeater to my view. And it took me a while even to understand why people were saying that. And I don't think that Sam has made a big deal out of that in public, and certainly not about me in particular, but 1689 followers have, to me even. And I think one of the things is like, we need to get rid of that, because nobody that I know of holding the classical view thinks that. It's our Confessions 8:6, right? That the sacrifices weren't the basis of forgiveness of true sin. Christ was the basis of forgiveness of sins, and the virtue of his work, the efficacy of his work, was applied in advance, but through the Mosaic sacrifices or whatever other ordinance, as a means of grace. And so I think that's one of the things of like this whole like in themselves as kind of the obvious reason why there's a huge hole in classic Reformed covenant theology, I think needs just to go away, because I don't know of anybody who says that.
Yeah, that is an important place to locate some of the not just disagreements, but also speaking past one another, because I do think that the animal sacrifices are one of the premier examples of what needs to be clarified and who's saying what. Okay, so what are we actually saying? And one of the reasons why I do think it's a good argument to speak to our Paedo-Baptist Presbyterian brothers and point to the animal sacrifices. Why say that animal blood did not forgive sins? Well, there are better ways to say that to more clearly assert the argument. Animal blood did not cleanse the conscience. Animal blood did not cleanse the conscience, but animal blood did cleanse the flesh. And so the reason that we want to bring up animal sacrifices many times is not to defeat the idea that animal sacrifices were the foundation of forgiveness. I grant that. If anyone thinks that Presbyterians are saying Old Testament believers were forgiven on the basis of animal blood, then they don't understand, and they're wrong about that. The reason to talk about the animal sacrifices is not to defeat the idea that animal blood was the foundation for forgiveness in terms of the conscience, but rather it's to assert that there was a separate and different kind of cleansing that was effected and was accomplished by the animal sacrifices. And it's in bringing to light two different benefits present in the Old Covenant time: the benefits of animal blood to cleanse the flesh and the benefits of Christ to cleanse the conscience. That's where Baptists are going to say, that's why the Old Covenant is not the same as the New Covenant. It does not give the same benefits, but that's why the Old Covenant portrays or reveals or makes known and therefore delivers the benefits of the New Covenant. And so the reason to bring up the animal sacrifices is to assert the cleansing of the flesh, which Thomas Goodwin called a forgiveness of reprieval. They were forgiven by the animal blood, not in the conscience, but a reprieval not to be destroyed from Canaan, not to be destroyed for their sin. So from the Baptist perspective, they will locate the difference there, because they're saying that the Presbyterians have skipped over and failed to identify and acknowledge a true covenantal benefit in the Old Covenant through animal sacrifices, and thereby have flattened and equated the Old and New Covenants into no different than a difference of outward administration. So to repeat, Harrison's absolutely right that if 1689 Federalists or anyone thinks that the Paedo-Baptist is saying the benefits of Christ and the animal blood are the same thing, the animal blood gives the benefits of Christ in itself, no, that's not what they're saying. They're saying that Christ's blood is portrayed by the animal blood, and thereby they deliver Christ's benefits, which we affirm, but we see that as skipping over the primary and principal benefit and significance of the animal blood, which was to cleanse the flesh. And so when Baptists see Paedo-Baptists skipping that, or they think that they're skipping that, that's why they keep bringing it up, to say, but the scriptures clearly assert a benefit from the animal blood, and by not talking about it, you avoid the very foundation of the distinction between the Old and the New Covenants in substance, because they provide different benefits in themselves.
Yeah, okay, so there's a number of things there, and I know that we'll have to circle around that two-level typology aspect at some point. I personally, I know that this is a discussion, but I think it's kind of good to set that aside for a minute, because that's its own thing, and worth the time on it. I guess just to be clear, and this is not a response to what you've said exactly. It's just a lot of the criticism I hear is, well, the blood of animals couldn't forgive sin, and part of what you're saying is, well, it did on this aspect, but that's not the criticism I hear. And so I'm not talking to you in this. I am talking, but I'm just saying the people who make the criticism aren't saying what you're saying, and that's one of the reasons why I think, it needs to go away is because okay, we can tangle with what you've just said there in a different respect, but yeah, no Presbyterian, at least who would pass a Presbyterian exam, is saying animal blood, made people right with God. And yeah, it's good to hear you say, right. We didn't think that about Presbyterians. So
I've got a question for you, Harrison. So I've been trying to get some categories straight in my mind about my own view, and it has just raised so many questions. So in my understanding, Presbyterian covenant theology or Westminster federalism, everything after the covenant with Adam, or the covenant of works, is a covenant of grace, right? So then I came across this, interesting, situation about the Mosaic covenant. Is it a covenant of grace, or is it a republication of the covenant of works? And I saw this, OPC report on republication, and wanted to ask what you thought about it. From what I understand from the report, the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace, but it is an administrative republication of the covenant of works, not a substantial or substantive republication of the covenant of works. I know they're dealing with some distinctions there. So is the Mosaic covenant a covenant of grace or a covenant of works? Can it be both in different senses? What are your thoughts about that?
This is a great question. And that's what people always say when they're buying time to think out the answer. So there's a lot of disagreement on this. So I can give you my take. And I'm an OPC minister, and lots of other OPC ministers are going to give you a different view. So one of the things going on here is, you said the Mosaic covenant is a covenant of grace, and I kind of want to even pull back a little bit there and say, well, our confession, the Westminster Confession, is very clear, and if somebody disagrees, I think they're outside with what I'm about to say here. They're outside the bounds of the confession, that the Mosaic covenant is an administration of the covenant of grace, which means it delivers the gospel, right? I mean, I think, to simplify, one of Sam's criticisms in the past of the language of administration is it's too vague, and maybe there's something fair about that, and maybe we just play fast and loose and steam ahead without kind of outlining our terms. When I say an administration, I mean it applies. It's a delivery system, if we can put it crassly. So the Mosaic covenant delivers the covenant of grace. And in that respect, it applies Christ and his benefits to believers who participate in the means of grace with true faith. Now, that being said, okay, at the historical level, that's the difference between the law and the gospel, right? Is that no, it doesn't work to bring anybody into right relationship with God by works. It's by faith in Jesus Christ, the coming Messiah. At the historical level, I think that it resembles the covenant of works. And so in this respect, I want to say, well, yeah, redemptive, historically speaking, this is a very different looking administration. And so, all of them are very different looking from each other, even though they're delivering Christ and his benefits to believers through their ordinances. So the way that I've put it in the forthcoming book, I try to focus on systematic categories as the first thing, but you have to deal with redemptive history at some point. And I've tried to keep that as brief as possible, because there are so many books that do that already that are good and helpful. But the way that I've tried to put it there is the types and the ordinances so the ordinances of the Mosaic covenant are types of Christ's merit. You can't merit a person, an Israelite couldn't actually merit anything before God by them, in the sense of gaining everlasting life, anything like that. Now, there's a sense in which obedience plays a role in this, because it resembles the covenant of works, and they are trying to stay in the land, which is also a type of something else, though. And so I really want to emphasize that the works bit is typological, and in that sense serves as a means of grace. And so, Hebrews 10:1, that this covenant didn't have the appearance of the good things to come. That gets translated in the ESV. It didn't have the form, but its icon, right? It didn't have the image. It didn't have the appearance. yeah, it looked like the covenant of works. It looked legal, and yet it was delivering the substance of the covenant of grace, Christ and his benefits to everyone who participated in it with true faith. So I want to say, yes, it is both in a sense, in a very different sense. It's not an alternative way of salvation. And so it's an administration of the covenant of grace, not that it's a covenant of grace, but it resembles typologically the first covenant.
Okay, that's interesting. I'll have to chew on that some more. So, like when Paul talks about in Galatians about do this and live, and cursed is everyone who's hanged on a tree. I interpret those, I guess, as statements from the Mosaic covenant, which he does seem to be putting in conversation with the gospel in particular. And so I'm just interested how you kind of relate that. It's not a covenant of works, and it's delivering the gospel. It seems like Paul might be saying something different in Galatians. Do you have a thought about that Galatians text?
I
have bad
lots of thoughts about Galatians. I mean, so one, Paul is contrasting the Mosaic administration and the Abrahamic and our covenants, whatever you want to call them. So one, he's definitely tying the gospel, in my view, to the Abrahamic promises. I don't know how else we would reckon with this sort of thing, that to say it is the covenant of works, and that the gospel wasn't available in the Mosaic covenant. That's an odd thing to. I mean, that's when we get to the implication of, okay, if it's not that, well, then how do people come to faith? And if that's not an option for people to come to faith, well, then there weren't any believers. And so, I mean, that's a problem that we're all sort of reckoning with, I suppose, because Hebrews 11 gives us a catalog of believers, and a lot of them live under the Mosaic covenant. And Sam and I have kind of already said the same thing, that these sacrifices served as means of grace, that giving the benefits of Christ to believers. So this isn't, I mean, as far as we've gotten in this conversation, this point isn't really a matter of division. Historically speaking, I mean, I guess, again, like we come back to, these look very different. The Mosaic covenant, I think, looks like the covenant of works. And so when it says do this and live, it's republishing, if you will. That gets a load. I've sort of pulled back from using that, mainly because it's so loaded, and people just react to it. And I've tried to hear the pushback to Meredith Klein's views, and kind of pull the horns off of it where I can, in my presentation at least. So to say that it is the covenant of works, I think doesn't help anybody. To say that it is that. But historically, did it serve a very different purpose in terms of its types and ordinances than Abraham, than Noah, than the first, proto-evangelicum? Well, yeah. And so it is. I mean, so Galatians 4, right, I think is a key bit that, the heir, as long as he's a child, is no different from a slave, though he's the owner of everything. But he's under guardians and managers until the date set by the father. In the same way also, so in the same, writing to Gentiles, in the same way as Israel was under this type and manager under the Mosaic covenant, we also, when we were children, were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world. And so what you have going on here is that like Israel under the Mosaic covenant encapsulates what's going on to the whole world under the elementary principles, which I take to be the natural law. And that's how a lot of ancient writers are taking that too. That this is essentially, well, the Mosaic covenant depicts, reannounces, teaches about, as a pedagogue, what it's like to be under the law as the whole world. And yet there were believers coming to faith. And part of it was the law is teaching them, well, you see how you went into exile? It's because you can't do it. And you need the Savior. And the second use of the law is perhaps prominent, not exclusive, but prominent under Moses.
So I've got two questions that are somewhat unrelated. Number one, if you're watching this right now and you haven't subscribed to YouTube, let me be the annoying guy to go ahead and hit subscribe and hit the like button. If you watch this far, you like the content, so go ahead and do that to support us. Number two, Sam, I wanted to make sure you get an opportunity to lay out probably the laundry list of misconceptions about 1689 federalism or Baptist covenant theology. And maybe we can talk about some of those particular things that you think are going in the other direction of Presbyterians or misunderstanding about what you're trying to say in your own covenant theology.
Sure. I do have a list of those things. I don't know if we'll get to all of them, but some are pretty short, and some of them are legitimate in certain senses. But what I mean is sometimes the criticism lands because Baptists don't do a good job in speaking for themselves. So one of the common things that really irks me, I say, man, I wish people would stop saying that, but I understand why they do, is Presbyterian brothers often say, Baptists view baptism merely as a profession of faith, and they criticize that. And I think they're right to criticize that for the people whom they are criticizing. But the misconception that needs to be clarified is that for confessional Baptists, Second London Baptists, our confession is quite clear in the order that it takes, that it is first, baptism is first a sign unto the party baptized of their engrafting into Christ. It is first God signing to the baptizand. And then it says it is also a sign of their giving up their life unto God. And so therefore, a confessional Baptist should have a proper, what I might call, two-way significance in baptism. It is God's word to his people, baptism is, and it's also the word of God's people unto him, swearing and answering, stipulation and restipulation. So are there not innumerable instances of Baptists who wrongly reduce baptism to just, this is my profession of faith? Yes, and so the criticism lands in many cases. But for particular Baptists or Reformed Baptists of the confessional sort, and not just them, but particularly them, I can speak for them, that criticism doesn't land on them, and it should not be used against them. And there's kind of an irony here, because if Baptists are guilty of making baptism one way, man to God, there are many Paedo-Baptists who are guilty of the opposite error by making it one way from God to man. They say baptism is just God's word to the people, and that's why the baptizand is passive, and they correlate this to infant baptism. It's God's word to his people. And they fail to understand that historically, Protestant theology and even portions of Reformed theology very clearly understood baptism to be two-way. It is God's word to his people, but it's also the word of God's people to God. The Book of Common Prayer does this. The Westminster Assembly debated this and decided, yes, there must be a profession of faith in baptism. The Leiden Synopsis requires faith antecedent and accompanying baptism. So the idea that baptism is God's word to his people and the word of God's people back to him is a historical, traditional Protestant, Reformed, and beyond understanding of baptism. Baptists get it wrong when they make it one way. This is my profession of faith. But our Paedo-Baptist brothers also get it wrong when they say this is just God's word to his people. And so I want both sides to stop saying these things and let us agree on the two-way nature of the sacrament, the word to the people and the word of the people to God. So that's one thing I wish that could be better cleared up.
I agree with what Sam said. Yeah, I guess the one, this isn't a pushback really. It's kind of to carry on I've never thought that, you know, your view, Sam, as a confessional Baptist was that it, you know, that it was just the profession of faith. Like, I'm from Alabama, right? So one, like, I have to know how to be friends with Baptists, or I would have had no friends. Even some of the Presbyterians are Baptists, where I'm from, but on top of that, like, as you know, there are all kinds of Baptists, and so, I mean, that would be the prevailing Baptist outlook, you know, in the heart of the Southern Baptist Convention in Alabama. And so, I mean, yeah, maybe we need to be better about clarifying who our aim is. And maybe some people are saying that you say that. I don't think I have. And yeah, that's kind of the one kind of wrench in the works here, is that while you don't say that, some Baptists do, as you admitted.
Sure.
And so that's, yeah, that's just more for.
No, I think that's fair. I mean, pretty much every Baptist church I've been at, until I was really exposed to Presbyterianism, I didn't really realize it, but everybody was saying baptism is just, it's your pledge of allegiance or your confession. And that was it. There was nothing on the other side. And that's one thing that I really appreciated being exposed to paedobaptism, was this reality that there is this two-natured side to it. But I realized, for me anyway, I don't have to become a paedobaptist to say that. I can still say this is a declaration of God's promise to me, and not be a paedobaptist about it. Though I think you're probably right that it is the prevailing opinion, at least in SBC churches. However, it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things going on there is that, I mean, a lot of Baptists are Arminian, and don't believe in means of grace. A lot of Baptists, not by implication or wrong accusation, but in reality, are just about Anabaptist. Like, the means of grace don't mean much, and that's yeah. You think they do mean stuff, and so that doesn't apply to you. But there is kind of this whole world where that's the case.
Sam, I have a question for you. Sometimes I read stuff that it gets billed as 1689 federalism, but I don't think it is. So maybe that's part of my own confusion. But some people will seem to say that in the Abrahamic covenant, you have two distinct, separate covenants. Is that representative of 1689 federalism, where you have a covenant of grace and a covenant of works, one in Genesis 15, or one in Genesis 17? You have a different one, or is there just one covenant with Abraham?
I've said this several times before, and it just has to be repeated again, that 1689 federalism has largely been an online movement, with limited literature representing it, and really no centralized, apart from the website, very little that centralizes what it is and what it is not. So some years ago, I kind of just resolved, I'm going to speak for myself, and if others agree with me, great. And if they call that 1689 federalism, great. But I can't control what other people claim under that name and banner. And I'm not trying to distance myself from that. I'm just trying to acknowledge the inherent sort of weaknesses or liabilities of the medium in which it's been distributed, etc. So you probably could find quote unquote 1689 federalists, perhaps even published ones, who have asserted views like that. But if you ask me, is that 1689 federalism? All I can really say is I don't believe that. I believe that God made a covenant with Abraham that I would not classify either as a covenant of works or a covenant of grace. Although I do believe that the covenant of grace is most certainly revealed, pushed forward, and delivered, again, administered, applied, and communicated, or given to God's people through that. But I would not, I have in places used language of calling it a covenant of works because it will disinherit you if you violate its positive law of circumcision. But it also has, I've also clearly said that it has an underlying guaranteed national corporate element that the people cannot ultimately be cut off or entirely cut off, and that carries through the Old Testament. But because God remembered his oath to Abraham, he did not cut them off, and Moses appeals to that, etc. So that's why you can't just make it like the covenant of works, break it once and it's all done. No, individuals can cut themselves off. And so it has an element of, if we want to use these terms, I'm not crazy about them, conditionality. Certainly you see that, but it's not functioning like Eden, nor is it functioning like the new covenant either. So if you ask me, are there two different covenants being transacted here in Genesis 12, 15, 17? I'm going to say no. There is the Abrahamic covenant here, which contributes to the mystery of Christ and the new covenant. But I don't agree with the way that you had said others portray that. And what represents 1689 federalism, maybe this is frustrating for other people to hear, like, hey, come on, why don't you just say what it is or what it isn't? I'll tell you what I believe. And if others agree with that, great. And if you want to call that 1689 federalism, awesome. But it is, yeah, it suffers from some of the inherent difficulties of where and how it has been distributed.
And is that partly due to also the flexibility that we might find in the Second London Confession, where you can have, I think, potentially different views and still confess what's found there?
Yes and no. So 1689 federalism, as I understand it, would be a particular way of seeing the covenants, whereas the confession is broader than 1689 federalism. The confession is quite broad, in fact. And so you could have a number of different views about the Abrahamic covenant, the Mosaic covenant, etc., and still be within the boundaries of the Second London Confession. So the fact that 1689 federalism is diverse is not so much due to the confession's broadness as it is due to, I think, the limited nature of or due to the lack of centralization or standardization of what is held or taught under that banner.
May I jump in? So the first thing is, I think Sam is exactly right. And I about the sort of breadth of 1689 federalism. And for my part, which isn't the same as what every Presbyterian is going to take, I mean, I've sort of defaulted to, well, if I'm gonna interact with a confessional Baptist on covenants, it's going to be Sam. One, because I mean, I trust Sam as a brother in the fundamentals, even though we should all hate that phrase. I do. I've asked Sam to preach at the church in London when I was there. It didn't work out because of illness, not because of anything else. And I'd have him preach again if he was willing. So, there's that. There are other people who are under the 1689 Federalist head that, like, I probably wouldn't let them take communion at my church, just because of what I know about their public views about doctrine. And maybe that's mean, but like, there are some that I'm not sure that they have a credible profession of faith. And I'm not talking about just like people. I mean, some of the teachers in seminary. So yeah, I think that indicates a very wide breadth and of the movement. And Sam is the best. I mean, in my estimation, Sam's kind of the best voice in it. And so talk to him. If I can follow up on the points made, though. So, like, I mean, this is part of where, like, we get confused. And I mean, Sam, like, I've tried really hard to listen carefully to you if I'm gonna respond to this. But I mean, there are claims made. So I mean, here this is maybe isn't fair, but like, I've got your book, and you say, in other words, talking about Abraham, this is a demand for strict obedience from Abraham and his descendants, and then consequently, this covenant can be classified as a covenant based on works or obedience. And I hear what you just said about, well, it's not one and done like in Eden, I guess, but strict obedience seemed to be strict obedience, and that, I mean, this is that phrase, even when Garrett asked me, is it a covenant of grace? I was like, well, that's not really the way anybody talks about it. Is it a covenant of grace? But yeah, I mean, maybe even just for my benefit, but also for everybody's benefit, can you unpack that a little of strict obedience, and it's a covenant based on works for Abraham.
Sure. So I see Genesis 15 and 17 working together as one covenant. And in Genesis 15, Abraham says, but how shall I know? How shall this be? And God says, know for certain. He passes through the parts. I will multiply you. I will bring your descendants into Canaan. So that provides that underlying, no question, God will do this, a guarantee that the descendants will be multiplied and brought into the land, etc. But in Genesis 17, there's an addition, there's an expansion of that covenantal relationship where God says, but as for you, you and your descendants after you, you shall keep or guard, I believe it's shamar, you shall guard my covenant. And then he gives them the command of circumcision. And then God says, if you are not circumcised in the foreskin of your flesh, if you refuse this, then it says you have broken my covenant and you are cut off from my people. The one who does not has broken my covenant and is cut off from his people. So I'm just trying to acknowledge the straightforward nature of here's a positive law, circumcision, which you must shamar, you must guard it, you must keep it. And if you do not, you have broken the covenant, violated its terms, and you are disinherited. You are excluded and expelled from the blessings that God will absolutely bring to the people in general. So I say that it is corporately guaranteed, but individually conditioned. And so the individual must be obedient. The individual must obey God's law, or God says, you've broken and I will disinherit. If there are better ways to more precisely communicate that, I'm definitely always trying to do a better job of that. But it sounds like strict obedience to me. Guard it, break it, disinherited. Those are God's terms. And I see that, of course, expanded in Moses, but we don't need to talk about that. And so I'm willing to use that language. And I said it can be classified as a covenant based on obedience, but with these qualifications, that it's corporately guaranteed, individually conditioned. And so whether or not we agree, that's what I'm trying to communicate.
Yeah. Well, and if you had said that about Moses, you do say that about Moses, but and there's a sense in which it seems like they're all covenants of works except the new covenant, which, okay, fine, maybe in the paradigm. I find it interesting there that you just said corporately guaranteed but individually conditioned. Well, I guess it's hard for me not to think that strikes of you can participate in the external administration without partaking of the substance, which is kind of the view that Presbyterians take, that, of redemptive history, that there's covenants where people can participate outwardly and individuals don't get the stuff, Christ and his benefits. And I don't really know exactly what to do with it except to flag that, well, that's very interesting that you have that paradigm for the Old Testament when that's kind of, I thought that you didn't like that at all. But I think there is something to add on to there, because Kant, in that respect, of all the things you just said, isn't there an aspect of where that's true about the new covenant, without making it a covenant of works? In that, if somebody, so even corporately, right? I refuse to preach the word. Well, okay, that's not really how the new covenant works. So, you don't get to make a credible profession of faith if somebody refuses baptism, or even perhaps more directly, because, and this is one of the things that I'm not sure that I think, even you, I like you, so I can say edgy things, have reckoned with the fact that the new covenant has an external administration. And I know you've addressed it, but I just don't know that it's thought to the bottom clearly enough for me, because Jesus says, this is the new covenant in my blood. And he says it about the Lord's Supper. And so, I mean, I think you define the new covenant as forgiveness in the blood of Christ. Like, well, that's a chief benefit. But Jesus says the new covenant is the cup. And I guess, one for the other, metonymy, the supper. And if somebody refuses the supper, I mean, it seems like, well, eventually we're going to say, we're not sure we can believe your profession of faith is credible if you're refusing to participate in the external means of grace, in the way that God has commanded. So that seems to be kind of a tension hanging in this of like, okay, yeah, fine. I get what you said about Abraham. And apart from the terminology, the kind of what you said there seems accurate. If somebody refuses to be involved in the external administration, refuses circumcision as the sign of this, they're disinherited, fine. But there's aspects where that is true in the new covenant too.
One of the misconceptions that I wrote down separate from this was, quote, Baptists reject the distinction between the substance and administration of a covenant. And I was like, we need to clarify this misconception. So we've hit it from a different angle. What we're currently talking about has multiple questions, and unfortunately, I believe that they're being equated. I think that two analogous things are being made identical. And that's one of my common gripes about these debates is analogy is not identity. Just because two things are analogous, it doesn't make, or paralleled, it doesn't make them the same. And so the way that rejection of circumcision functions in the Abrahamic covenant does not make it a paradigm for the new covenant, although there are parallels between them. Because if we make them identical and we make the Abrahamic covenant the paradigm, then those who reject the external administration and are cut off become a feature rather than a bug. And we regard them as a bug, something that should not happen. And when it becomes known, it is to be dealt with, as opposed to the other way around, which automatically includes non-participants in the external administration, or unable to be judged as valid participants they're participating in the external administration until they exclude themselves. The Leiden Synopsis speaks that way, that the children of believing parents are to be included until they choose to exclude themselves. That's very much taking the Abrahamic paradigm and one-to-oneing it with the church and the new covenant administration of the covenant of grace. We would see a parallel and we would see an analogy, but not an identity. So setting that aside, we would agree with the distinction between the substance of the covenant, its inward invisible benefits, and the external administration of the covenant. So not everyone who's eating the bread and drinking the cup is necessarily feeding on Christ by faith. Not everyone who's baptized is partaking of Christ by faith in baptism, etc. So we would acknowledge that. When people say something like we reject the substance administration distinction, what we're saying is we reject the use of that distinction as the explanation for the difference between the old and new covenants. The idea that the old and new covenants are one in substance but different in administration, that's what 1689 Federalists or myself would reject. But the idea that there is the inward invisible benefits of the covenant, the substance, and the outward visible external administration of it in its ordinances, we would absolutely affirm that. We affirm the visible and invisible church, and that not those who go out from us went out from us because they were not of us, and so on and so forth. So Baptists, and I've said this many times in other podcasts, that I myself have not been as careful as I should have in the past. And by now, 1689 Federalism is about 10 years old, if not more. And so in those 10-year-old videos and other early blog posts and things that I wrote, I was not as careful as I should have been in speaking about the substance and administration distinction. And I've had to walk back or qualify or correct myself many times since then, because it's put the idea in people's heads, and others have run with that language to my discredit for having used language that says things like, we reject the substance administration distinction. Well, we reject its use and application as the explanation for the difference between the Old and New Covenants, but we don't reject, and historically speaking, the Baptists did not reject the distinction between the substance and administration. So full circle, we can affirm a sort of corporate individual tension in the church today as those who profess the faith. Our confession says that those who profess faith are to be baptized. And that constitutes the visible church. But within that, there will be unbelievers, but they are a bug, not a feature, and they are to be excluded as when they show or lack fruit in their lives. And were they really in the covenant? I find that question to be somewhat poorly worded. You didn't use that language. I'm using that language. Is treason real? Is espionage real? The reality is not the right category. They really were partaking of the external administration of the covenant. It really happened, but they were not truly partaking of Christ. And so it's true and false are the better categories to use instead of real or not real. And so we would acknowledge that unbelievers falsely partake of the covenant, but truly they do not. And so I believe that the apostasy passages and arguments largely, in my opinion, just fall flat, as we pretty much agree here. But one of the reasons why there's still lack of understanding is the analogy versus identity between Abraham and the church and such things. So hopefully maybe this has clarified some things, even if there's still, of course, disagreements here and there. Maybe that clarifies for some, even for Baptists, better ways of communicating some of these concepts so that we more maturely or more carefully express our doctrine of the visible church, which really is what the confession lays out for confessional Baptists. So
that's really helpful.
How focused that's been, but I hope that maybe clarified some things.
That's really helpful. I appreciate that. I mean, we should be able to say, I mean, also without repercussion, that we've changed our minds and refined our formulations. So good for you for doing that. I commend that and appreciate that. That helps me. I have two thoughts to follow up. And I do kind of want to get to both of them. So I'm just saying that to myself so I don't lose track of them. So one is an outright question. I'm not trying to catch you. On the substance administration thing, I have understood you to say that the Old Testament covenants don't deliver the same substance as the new covenant. Is that right?
Well, that's where we get into the two-level typology, which is probably larger than this discussion. I would say that in and of themselves, let's just use the animal blood, and I'll try to be quick with it. In and of itself, the blood of bulls and goats does take away sin in the sense of purification of the flesh or a forgiveness of reprieval. So the substance of the old covenant is going to be Canaan and life in Canaan. That is the benefit that the old covenant in itself delivers. But through typology, it points above and beyond itself to the new covenant. And the new covenant substance is delivered, I'm willing to say, through those old covenant ordinances, but secondarily and only typologically. And so it's only by faith seeing beyond the earthly level that the heavenly benefits or the new covenant benefits are delivered to believers in the Old Testament. Whereas they all receive a forgiveness of reprieval from animal blood, only some of them receive a cleansing of the conscience through Christ's blood as they see it by faith. So does the old covenant deliver the substance of the new covenant? It depends. We distinguish. In and of itself, no. Secondarily, through typology, yes.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I want to say that, I mean, that's helpful because, I mean, so I think that this is one of the things. So it was on my list to bring this up in a sense of, I hear about confessional Baptists thinking that, well, that it's the new covenant's benefits, that's also like one of these things, like it's not on the basis of, and I want to say, yeah, fine, we all affirm, I mean, at least, in my tradition, that it's the new covenant benefits that come through the means of grace. I mean, this is, and I've actually had a 1689 guy say to me, "You can't say this," which I thought was funny, because it's just the Westminster Shorter Catechism that a sacrament is a holy ordinance instituted by Christ, wherein by sensible signs Christ and the benefits of the new covenant are represented, sealed, and applied to believers. And then the next question is, what are the sacraments of the New Testament? And so there's a principle about what a sacrament does. It represents, seals, and applies the Christ and the new covenant benefits. So the kind of like, well, but it's the new covenant benefits, fine, and not that you and I have had a big back and forth on this, but like, this is one of the things that I think 1689 guys need to quit saying. The whole, like, on the basis of another covenant. Yeah, it's in the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And Turretin takes this and says the spiritual benefit to believers is identical in the sacraments across redemptive history. And yet here we go. It's always the benefits of the new covenant. So
that just brings us back to the previous statement of, that's not where the disagreement is located. The disagreement is located in, was there a separate substance and benefit that the old covenant did deliver in itself? So that's what I'm saying. You're right to say, but we agree about that. We do, because it's a different question where we disagree.
Yeah, we can come back to that. And I think we should. But I mean, so the other thing is, I guess I would say that, like, unbelief was, the false participation, as you put it, which is a good way to put it, and I like that, was always a bug. That's part of what, so I preached through Jude twice now, at two different churches, and I'm working on a book on Jude, and there's a series of blogs going up, and I just think it's a fascinating little book. And one of the things that catches me here is verse 5. Now I want to remind you, although you once fully knew it, that Jesus, after saving a people out of the land of Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus has a corporate people. Now, it's not just the Lord. It's not just God, even though he's called Jesus the Lord. So even if it was the Lord, it's Jesus. Jesus has a corporate people, and, that are bound to him. And one, there's unbelievers in their midst. And so the people of Jesus can contain this. But second, it is a problem. It was a problem when unbelievers were in Jesus's people at the Exodus, because he killed the unbelievers, which clearly expresses that he wasn't, satisfied with that. And so it was always a bug for unbelievers to be amidst the people of God. And I guess that's one of the things, is like, you're right, it's a bug. And I guess the difference is, I'm saying it was always a bug.
There are species of faith, and in the Old Testament, in the Old Covenant, you see many times accusations of, but you did not believe. And it would be a mistake to reduce them all to saving faith. So, for example, the 10 spies that returned from Canaan, and Israel that believes their bad report, after that it is said, because you did not believe, therefore you shall not enter the land. And there are other statements like that, especially about the wilderness generation. And so we have to be careful not to make all of those saving faith statements believers, unbelievers, without distinction. And so again, we have analogy and identity conflation, I believe, where the Old Testament people are regularly used as an illustration and an analogy for the church in the book of Hebrews or in Jude, and their unbelief is pointed out as reasons why they were destroyed or judged or such things, but we cannot one-to-one at all times necessarily those categories of belief and believer, unbelief and unbeliever, etc. Because in many cases, the argument is they did not believe that God would give them the land. They did not believe that God would indeed give them their inheritance. And so they failed to press forward to it. And therefore, God destroyed them or disinherited them, etc. And so we, knowing that Jesus has won heaven for us, if they pressed forward in their circumstances or did not and were destroyed, we, under our circumstances, in a new and better covenant with a better mediator, etc., we ought to press forward. And if they were judged under the law, we will be judged for not doing so under the gospel, etc. So there are analogies between belief in God's promises or unbelief in God's promises then that don't necessarily have an identity, a one-to-one equation with the church and the new covenant today. So that would be my sort of broad answer for why we cannot just immediately use those terms and those categories to say, look, you have believers, and if I could speak for Paedo-Baptist, believers and their children in a corporate covenant back then, believers and their children in a corporate covenant now. Those categories can't necessarily be used one-to-one. So
Well,
I'll just leave it at that. But
yeah, that's fine, I guess. And I don't want to go into like a full thing about, but I mean, I just find this a really helpful example in Scripture because it's not just a corporate covenant, and it's a corporate people of Jesus.
mm-hmm.
And Jude is using this not just as an example of bad things, but he's saying that these are examples of the same false teachers in the church. And I mean, yeah, he's reminding them that this had happened because certain people have crept in unnoticed into your church. The Greek word there is because it almost sounds like weaseled in, which I really like. Just because certain ungodly people have weaseled in, designated for condemnation, ungodly people. So they've gotten into the church. And I'm going to prove this to you because it happened in the Old Testament. And that is kind of the bulk of 5 to 17 in here is there's examples of what's happening to you. And it's the people of Jesus shot straight through. So, yeah, we don't have to chase that forever, but I just, you're right. There are different species of faith. And yes, we can't just leap to them, but I think there are examples that are the same.
Yeah, and I think that you're right that, well, I wouldn't say I think that you're right necessarily, but I think you make a good point to say Baptists need a good explanation for in what sense is Jesus in what sense do these people belong to Jesus? I think that is a good question that Baptists need to have a better answer for.
I do want to just comment now at this moment. I want to give a little bit of time for audience if they have questions or things that they have found to be misunderstood in the past that seem to be pretty common. If we want to have any of those, I'll put them on the screen here. I know there's been a lot of stuff you guys have chatted throughout this time, but if you've got something you want to add in, chat it now and I'll bring it forward. While we're waiting on some of those to come in, I don't know if one of you wants to jump in and just do another misconception that you've seemed to have received quite often.
I'll do a quick one, an easy one.
Yeah.
And this is the same as like Baptists make baptism one way, which is true in so many cases, as we've noted. Another one is Baptists reject the word sacrament. Of course, there's plenty of Baptists that you could point out that say things like this, which is wrong. Historically speaking, in the 17th century, it gets used all the time. I have a long list of examples of particular Baptists who use it just as a normal word. It's true. It's deleted from the confession. It's replaced with ordinance, but that's not a rejection of the term or sacramentology in general. There's other reasons for that change. So while this criticism rightly lands on many or plenty of Baptists, at least in our larger national context, it shouldn't land on particular Baptists or Reformed Baptists of a confessional stripe, because I like that word and it's used and we should use it and we shouldn't lose it at all. So Baptists do better, and Paedo-Baptist brothers, just say who you're talking about when you criticize them.
I didn't even know that was a criticism of you guys. So
Yeah,
I knew you.
It happens.
I think one of the easy ones. I mean, it's already come up is flattening redemptive history. Presbyterians flatten it. Now, I guess there's two senses of this. If you mean historically, we make it all the same. I think there's probably some books where they do the redemptive historical sweep of stuff that it does do that, and we should do better at emphasizing historical differences and what they're doing in contributing to the one plan. And so, yeah, I think that there's a fairness to some treatments of this. If it's just that there's the one substance delivered through all the covenants, honestly, like if flattening means Jesus gets to all the believers through all the covenants, like if flattening means Jesus is the heart of the covenants and the heart of the Bible, actually, yeah, man, I'm flat as a pancake. I'm happy with that one. And so I'll own that. If making the covenants about Christ means flattening, yeah, I'm Oklahoma all day long. But if you mean historically, I mean, even as we've outlined it here, I at least try to reckon with, Abraham is not Moses. The Mosaic covenant and the Davidic covenant have specific connections. The Noahic covenant is not Abraham. There are real maybe that's not even the right way to say it. There are real differences between the covenants, nonetheless, while they all deliver Jesus through their ordinances that are means of grace.
Cool. Helpful. One question that seems to have come up several times. I'm going to show this one. I don't know if we have enough time to really devote to it, but is there a way to summarize your disagreement, Harrison, around this scheme?
Yeah. I mean, I'll go for. So Sam and I talked a lot about this, and I've said this in print and to him, and I don't think that he'll think this is an unfair way to put it. I mean, we both agree that there's type and anti-type, and I think that that's supposed to be the two levels. I struggle to see how the way that Sam puts it has real internal coherence, and he knows I think that. I hate saying mean things to my friends, but I trust he'll forgive me and take it in the spirit it's meant. But what I mean by that is because all the types are two levels. There's type and anti-type, but I think that Sam breaks up features of the typology and kind of decides what's type and what's not. So he talks about the earthly benefits. And I want to say, yes, I understand that there's a relationship between like animal sacrifices and tenure in the land. Absolutely. And both of those are part of the types. It's not that the animals are the type. It's the land is also typical of new creation life. And the relationship between the sacrifice rendered and, as a type and the typical earthly blessing, the relationship is also typological. That when Christ, the ultimate sacrifice, dies, he paves the way into new creation life. And so to sum it up, I would say the whole kit and caboodle is typological, right? Every feature with their binding relationships. And sometimes it seems like Sam's way of parsing this separates them a little, where he gets to decide this is an earthly benefit that's primary, and then there's secondarily the spiritual aspect. And I just want to say, both of those are types. Animal sacrifice to benefit, is type. It's not here's type, earthly benefit, heavenly benefit. It's the whole thing is typological. So that's I don't think I've misunderstood him. This is the implication aspect, right? And I get that this is where we're actually just going to disagree, and probably not. A lot of people have misunderstood Sam on this. That is true. I have in the past. I don't think I do anymore. He can tell me I'm wrong, but yeah, I think that's the gist of my pushback on it.
Cool. Another question that has come up a couple of times. I think I've seen Hebrews 10:1 brought forth. So just for reference, if you're not looking it up on another tab right now, it says, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near." So is there a distinction in how you guys would understand that verse?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I hear this appealed to a lot. I mean, so I know that this comes from this is one of the 1689 like key verses, and so I'd love to hear what Sam says, but I also do want to take a stab at this one. It does say the law has a shadow of the good things to come, so it's not completely unrelated to eschatological benefits in Christ. So there's that, and second, of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. So the point here is it has a shadow, not the appearance. So the word under form there in Greek is icon, image, appearance, right? I mean, that's one of the BDAG entries, appearance. And it's like, yeah, we've talked about this. It has a shadow of the good things to come because it points to Christ, but it doesn't have the appearance because it looks like the covenant of works. I think this actually runs the opposite of the way that question goes, because I'm saying it's got a shadow of the good things to come. It's a typological covenant. It depicts Christ and his benefits, and its features give Christ and his new covenant benefits to believers, but it doesn't look like the new covenant. That's why Jeremiah distinguishes those two specific ones. It's not going to be like that. It's going to exhibit the substance, bang, smack in the face, right? It doesn't. This one doesn't have the appearance of the new, and I own that. Like I want that. It's not the same. It's typological. So there's my thing. Is it doesn't have the appearance of the new covenant. It's got the shadow of the new covenant, though, so they're not completely like, yeah.
Sam, any follow up before I ask another question?
Sure, I'll try to be quick. In the Old Covenant, God gives the people of Israel a tent on earth where his glory dwells and where he manifests his presence among them. And in order for him to dwell among them and in order for them to draw near to him, they must be clean. They must be holy. And so God gives them a holiness by setting them apart with circumcision. And he gives them a holiness by redeeming them from Egypt and making them his people. And he allows them to maintain that holiness by the way that they eat, the way that they interact with people, their whole cultic life, and ways to redress unholiness through the sacrificial system and the various offerings that they may make to restore their purity. And so the Old Covenant, it could not make them perfect. They could not. They were unable to fully draw near to God. There was always distance. There was always separation. God is among them. They are a holy people, but there's all of this imperfection in the people themselves, and they're kept away. They're kept at a distance from God. And so while it is an incredible blessing to be God's people and for him to dwell among them, there's nevertheless imperfection involved. And what Christ does is he gives us entrance into the heavenly temple, the heavenly holy of holies not made with hands. No Israelite would dare to enter the holy of holies on earth. But the temple, the veil of the temple is torn when Jesus dies. And in his ascension, he enters into the heavenly holy of holies and he sits down there. And we are seated with him. And so the new covenant brings us into a heavenly glory and into the presence of God in a way that the old covenant never could and never did in itself. And yet it was a shadow. It was a representation of a greater and better glory that Jesus has given to us in the new covenant. And that's why in the book of Hebrews, to go back to the shadow, to go back to the earthly temple in the old covenant is to say, Jesus is not the Christ. and his covenant is a farce. It doesn't actually bring us into heaven. It doesn't actually bring us into that glory. So that's how I would understand Hebrews 10 saying, do not go back, because if you go back, you are rejecting Jesus Christ and his covenant, which is a better covenant founded on better promises with a better holiness and a better everything. And those animal sacrifices can't help you. They never could do what Jesus has done.
To some degree, I want to say yes. So there's a good chunk of that I want to say yes. Sam just ended preaching, and that was great. He should. One of the things to bring up that did come out there, and we don't have time to do this today, but I'm going to pull the pin on the theological hand grenade and run. One of the things that I have a real reservation, and we significantly disagree about, was at one point I had been talking to you about how I think your view implies that there was a different outworking of salvation for Old Testament saints than in the New Covenant. And whether we were talking past each other or what happened, you kind of said no. But you've got a book about the limbus patrum, and that is one of the things that I really that one I can't go with you on that. And you've kind of raised a point that a lot of Presbyterians are reading you thinking what you just said about how nothing about it, and not bringing in the means of grace aspect, proleptically speaking, gets you into heaven. And we're thinking that means Old Testament believers didn't go to heaven. And I think one of the things that if people are going to follow you, they need to own that, because that causes a lot of confusion. Because we're saying we think your view implies that, and you've come out and said, no, it doesn't imply it. It is that. And we're in favor of limbus patrum. They didn't go to heaven until after Jesus came. And rather than kind of dancing on that, I think everybody kind of needs to. Now, this makes it easier in a sense because we're not arguing about implications. It makes it harder in a sense that now at some point in time I have to convince you not to believe in the limbus patrum. But all that to say, so I mean, I'm thinking of this in particular because I put up a blog post that you had seen and approved of, and the only response I got back to that in a post where I tried to make your language better so that it didn't imply the limbus patrum, somebody came back and said, you're misrepresenting 1689 federalism because we don't believe in that sort of thing. One, yes, you do. And two, I tried to make it so that you didn't believe that. And so there's a whole knot around that issue that I don't know how to fix it, but that is one of the, and you've been honest. I know people are, and I've had discussions about this, and I know that I think they're listening. One of the friends I have with whom we've discussed this is like, you've said this isn't part of the confessional tradition, and the limbus patrum is outside of where our confessions go. And I think that is an important concession. So we don't have to argue about whether it's part of our tradition. The burden of proof is on you in that.
Can I answer? I'd love to answer this.
Go ahead.
I've got your book if that's going to be the answer.
Well, no. I'll try to be brief and direct. A couple of things. First off, it is within the Christian confessional tradition. The Reformed view of the dissent is not the dissent.
But you want to be Reformed
of the dissent. I'm sorry?
But you want to be Reformed Baptist.
Yes. But I don't affirm the Reformed view of the dissent, and it is a rejection of the Apostles' Creed. Sadly, it doesn't claim to be. Here's another say, what you imply. So I'm happy to affirm the dissent of Christ and the limbus patrum, recognizing it's a a tiny minority view among the Reformed, not so much among the Protestants. Okay, how is that coherent with Reformed covenant theology, however? And it's quite coherent with Reformed covenant theology because there's a difference between a right to something and possession of something. And so we would affirm that the Old Testament saints, through the blood of Christ, through the work of Christ, in their lifetime, they had their consciences cleansed. They were justified by faith in Jesus Christ, and they had all of those benefits in their life: regeneration, justification, sanctification, perseverance, etc. What we would then just, and I can only speak for myself, if we're really going to say, what does 1689 federalism believe? If we're talking about the limbus patrum, we're really talking about me. When they died, they were told that Lazarus was comforted and that he was separated from the wicked who were in torment by an impassable chasm, an impassable separation. So that means the saints of the Old Testament in their lifetime have consciences cleansed, sins forgiven. Upon death, their souls are in Abraham's bosom or upper Sheol, and they are resting. They're not being tormented. If they're suffering anything, it's a deprivation, a not yet entrance. And so they have not yet entered into heaven. Nevertheless, they had a right to it. They did not yet possess that inheritance, but they had a right to it through the covenant, through Jesus Christ. And it's Jesus' work, historically speaking, that brings them into heaven with us. So that, as the writer to the Hebrews says, so that it was not without us that they should enter in. We all have entrance into the heavenly holy of holies through the blood of Christ and the new covenant together, Jew and Gentile. But there was a historical progression, and we still affirm that today, all of us, when we say we have a right to the future glory, we have a right to the resurrection, but we don't yet possess it even when we die. When we die, praise the Lord, we will be souls in heaven now, but we will not yet possess the resurrected body. Are we being punished? Are we being tormented in some way? No, it's just there is a waiting. There is a not yet. And so we have a right to that glory, but we don't yet possess it. So also the Old Testament saints had a right to heaven, a title to it through the new covenant, but not yet possession of it. And now their souls are in heaven, as ours will be, but we don't yet possess the resurrection body. So those criticisms of the limbus patrum does not really undo at all the system of covenant theology that I would propose. If anything, it perfectly goes along with it. It's entirely consistent with an understanding of what the new covenant does and why it's superior to the old covenant, and what the old covenant didn't do and why it's inferior to the new covenant. So I really don't see the doctrine of the descent or the limbus patrum as a challenge to the covenant theology that I propose. If anything, I see it as reinforcing the inutility and inferiority of the old covenant and the utility and the superiority of the new covenant.
Yeah, so this is a huge issue that we could, and I guess the one thing I kind of want to say is, well, too, in light of your very last comment, is, well, I think you're absolutely right that it coheres with your covenant theology. And in fact, I mean, one of my suspicions is your covenant theology was already implying that, and then you found like kind of a resolution to the dialectic in the limbus patrum. I mean, you said like kind of at one point, like I read Matthew Emerson's book and this really seemed to resonate. So I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I just think that, yeah, that resolved a dialectic tension in the covenant theology. So yes, it coheres with your covenant theology. I don't think it coheres with the broader tradition of Reformed covenant theology, and that's fine. You're not arguing for that. The second thing I want to say, mainly for my own benefit, so that nobody starts sending me links to more stuff I need to read, is I did understand. Yeah, I don't think that there's a misconception about each other here. I think we do understand each other, and we actually just disagree here. And I'm not coming hard at you. It's just so that people don't think, oh, well, we need to keep reading so that we're not talking past each other. No, this is one where we're going to have to convince each other because it's a real disagreement, and it actually is there. And you're still my friend.
Very helpful. Well, I appreciate you both doing this. We're at the 90-minute mark now, which is what I had promised for these brothers. So I know that they're busy, but I know there's a bunch of questions in here. Hopefully we can do more stuff in the future if you had questions. I do appreciate everybody tuning in. Share this with your friends if you think it was useful. Hopefully we can continue. Yes, Sam, you've got another point. Go ahead.
I was wondering when we can hope to see Harrison's book.
Oh, good
question. I hope it's out by the end of the year. So it's in copy editing right now. And so I was told probably not by ETS, unfortunately. But I really hope by the end of the year.
Excellent. Well, once it's there, everybody check it out. We appreciate you guys listening and following along and participating with this. That's what makes this fun and useful. So everybody who's been tuning in, thanks. This is the only analytic Baptist and confessional podcast on the planet, and we'll talk to you guys soon.